be a recording. Obviously there'll be a recording, so I could actually just start. I'm going to start. Hello, I'm wearing my lucky May the Force Be With You top because it is the AQA literature exam tomorrow. Let's start with some of the basics. AQA have decided to give you 50 minutes per question instead of 45. Great news, that gives you extra planning time if you need it, but more importantly, it gets you extra writing time because points make prizes. The more points you make, the easier it is for you to get higher marks. I'm going to bash through the poetry, the 19th century novel, the poetry, then the 19th century novel, and then whatever the inspector calls is called, the 20th century novel. It's not a novel. So we'll start with the poetry. It's the least popular. This time you're not getting marked on form and structure, which is partly good news. However, that doesn't mean you don't write about form and structure, because obviously you will be able to include your form and structure in your answer when you're talking about your interpretation of the poem. Only do that if it's relevant. If it's not relevant, don't worry. You get the top marks for writing a conceptualized response. There are two ways to do that. You can compare each poem as you go, like a paragraph on each, or you can write all about one poem first and then write about the second poem, comparing back to the first. The examiners don't mind which method you use. If you are preparing for A-level, then the better method is to do all one poem first and then all one poem second. But if you're thinking about GCSE and you're never going to take the A-level, do it any way you like. The key things here is that you have to move through the poem chronologically, because that shows how the poet's view changes, and that allows you to show that there is a change in perspective. That gives you a conceptualized response, because this is the poet's perspective. I can see the change of view at the end. That is my concept, hence conceptualized response. As you know, when you fix on quotations, you're going to mention the method. Well, that's not difficult because absolutely everything in a poem is a method. The easy ones are metaphor, simile, personification, alliteration and sibilance. You can talk about the enjambment if it's relevant. In my experience, students write rubbish about enjambment. They write rubbish about caesura. So kind of avoid those unless you're absolutely certain about what you're saying. Every time you make a comparison, make sure you come back to the poet's reason for presenting things in that way. Does it matter how much you write about each poem? Well, no, the mark scheme doesn't require you to write evenly about each poem. So if you know one poem better than the other, you can write more about it. However, don't forget to keep comparing so that you get the comparison marks in this question. So that's the poetry done and dusted. Or is it? If you get a choice of poem to compare it to, it's often easier to pick a poem which was written before 1919 because they're more obviously full of techniques, and you will be able to make an intelligent comment about the form of the poem. Don't worry too much about the structure, but think about what form is this in? Is it a ballad? Is it a sonnet? Because there's a reason for the poet choosing that form that will be really easy for you to relate to the actual meaning of the poem. Okay, that's the poetry done. Now we move to the 19th century novel. So I'm going to start by talking about A Christmas Carol, then I'll carry on and talk about Jekyll and Hyde. And let's think about this tactically. So as you know, you're going to get an extract. Now the problem with the extract is that it's there to help students who don't really understand the novel. So the exam board's idea is we've got to let everybody do well in this exam. Therefore, we'll just give them an extract. And if they haven't learnt any quotations, they'll be able to pick out quotations from the extract. They'll have something to write about. They won't get a total fail. They'll get a mark. Well, that's great if you haven't done any revision, but if you're somebody who wants a good mark, it's really, really, really bad news to start with the extract. And it's frustrating when you read the exam paper and it says, start with the extract. But the mark scheme doesn't say, make sure the candidate has started with the extract. The mark scheme doesn't care about the extract, or does it? Well, this is what the mark scheme actually says. A critical, exploratory, and conceptualized response to the task and the whole text. Well, how will you make sure that you are giving a conceptualized response? The only way is to start moving from the beginning of the text towards the end and showing how the writer's point of view has changed. So if you were looking at a character, you would look at how that character was at the beginning and chart their changes towards the end, making that relevant to the question. Well, if your extract doesn't come from the very beginning, starting with the extract is going to stop you being conceptualized. It's going to make you write in the wrong order. It's a complete pain in the neck because it'll cost you marks to start with the extract. It makes it much harder to get a top grade. Not impossible, but much, much harder because you're not writing an argument that goes all the way through the piece. So my top advice with the 19th century model is to spend the first 3 or 4 minutes of your exam doing this. Read the question and write a plan, ignoring the extract. Pretend the extract doesn't exist. So if we take the 2022 sample stuff that the exam board has set out, we could have, let's see, A Christmas Carol. Where is it? Excuse me while I go through and find the Christmas Carol because it's quite far down. My family have stolen my desk. They're entertaining downstairs. Right, here we go. So A Christmas Carol. Starting with this extract. Explore how Dickens presents Scrooge's fears in A Christmas Carol. Okay, so I'm going to ignore the extract and I would talk about Scrooge's fears this way. I would argue that Scrooge is afraid of abandonment. If you've watched my videos, you'll know why I'm saying that. You might not think about it that way. You might want to argue that he's afraid of the ghosts. Fine, there's no problem with doing that. You could argue that he's afraid of death. There's no problem with that. You could argue that he's afraid of personal intimacy. There's nothing wrong with that. However, you would chart in your plan how those fears develop. What is it that causes him to change those fears? Is it Tiny Tim? Is it the ghosts? Is it Marley's influence? Is it Fred's influence? It doesn't matter. You can choose what you believe. But that is the point. What do you believe? So you're going to sit down, write your plan about what you believe causes the change in his fears. And then, this is where the conceptualized marks are. Why does Dickens present Scrooge in this way? Is he trying to say that his readers all have to be more like Scrooge? Is he trying to get his readers to understand Scrooge and sympathise with him? Is he trying to get his readers simply to laugh at Scrooge and his predicament? You know, there isn't a right answer. There is your interpretation. Now, you then follow the character through and you think, okay, well, I've got my 8 points that I'm going to make in this essay. Now I go to the extract and I see, right, where does that extract fit into my plan? Well, because it's going to be a spot where Scrooge is scared, it's bound to fit in your plan somewhere. And that's where you put in what you have to say about the extract. How much do you have to write about the extract? The examiners don't care. Like, they don't mind. 1 quotation, 2, 3, 4, 8. They really don't mind. They're not asking for you to balance it. And so as long as you include some of the extract, because you can't go against what the question has asked you, you're sorted. You will get a choice of the character or the theme question. You can get top grades in both, no bother at all. It's usually easier to get top grades in the theme question because the theme comes straight out with the author's idea. Let's check that. So the theme for A Christmas Carol, Mr. Salles, you don't get a theme question for that. It's for an Inspector Calls. How gutted am I, looking like an idiot. However, if you do get a theme, it's much easier, because they might ask you a theme instead of a character. It's much easier to get the top marks because the theme is the writer's ideas. Now, this is my way of not appearing like an idiot. When you are writing about the character, it's the theme that is going to get you the higher marks because it leads to the author's idea. So, we're dealing with Scrooge's fear. Well, the theme is going to be redemption, suggesting that everybody can change and influence the future by being either more generous employers or giving more to charity or just caring more about people, like Scrooge becomes a second father to Tiny Tim. So now we've got the idea of redemption, we can say that Scrooge's fears are there to explain his redemption. Or you might have the theme of Christmas. And so you therefore want to show his fears are a part of how Christmas was enjoyed in Victorian society. They would enjoy reading ghost stories to each other to get that frisson of fear at this festive time when the family are all together. Or you might want to think about the Victorian tradition of memento mori, the reminder, remember you must die. In other words, Christians had to make sure they led good lives because at any moment it could be over, and even more so in Victorian society. So the fears are there to remind the reader that they too might shuffle off this mortal coil at any moment, so they had to go out in the world and do some good. So that is my top bit of advice when you're writing about the character, relate it to whatever themes you know. That's always the author's purpose. That's always conceptualized. It's always the higher marks. Right, let's jump into... I'm not jumping at all, am I? Let's slowly walk into The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the question in the 2022 sample paper was, starting with this extract, explore how Stevenson creates mystery and tension. Man, that is a horrible question. Because every single writer writes their book to create mystery and tension. So how would you do that with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Well, you'd explore first, because you're being conceptualized, why Stevens creates this mystery. Well, he's writing a detective fiction genre because that is particularly popular at the time, and it allows him to talk about society's hypocrisy and society's fear of crime. The other reason is that he's introducing a hidden piece of context. So we never find out why Hyde commits whatever he commits. So if he murders Sir Danvers Carew, we never found out why. Now that is a central mystery of the novel. Stevenson is daring us to come up with an explanation because he doesn't give it to us. Jekyll comes up with an explanation, but Jekyll is not a reliable narrator. We know that Jekyll isn't a reliable narrator because we find out from Lanyon's letter what Jekyll did to tempt Lanyon into seeing him transform, which then led to Lanyon choosing to commit suicide. So we find a really detailed account from Lanyon about what happened, but when Jekyll writes about it for Utterson, he's very sketchy on the details. He doesn't suggest that he tempted Lanyon in any way. He doesn't suggest that he set it up so that Lanyon would see this transformation. So we know Jekyll is an unreliable narrator. And when he tells us that Hyde was suddenly overcome with passion to kill Sir Danvers Carew, that's just rubbish, because he doesn't kill anyone else, does he? In fact, the angriest he gets with anyone else is he punches a flower girl in the nose. Not a flower girl, sorry, somebody selling matches. Well, yes, that's really reprehensible behaviour, but compared to murdering somebody and battering them to death with a cane, it pales into insignificance, doesn't it? So we know there is a central mystery to the novel, which is why Hyde behaves as he does. We do know, though, because Jekyll confesses to us, that Hyde only exists to carry out Jekyll's desires. So we can infer Jekyll desired Sir Danvers Carew to be killed. But obviously he's not going to tell us why, and he's not going to tell us that that's what he wanted. But we do know that that's why Hyde is created, to have these experiences that Jekyll wants to experience inside the body of Hyde. Then we have all the debauchery and sexual experiences that Hyde is enjoying, which again, Jekyll refuses to explain to us. So that is a central mystery of the novel, and you have to come up with an explanation as to why that's there. But even more importantly, explain why Stevenson withdraws and doesn't tell his readers why that's there. The other thing that we've got here with this air of mystery is the non-chronological way that we find out the story. So we only find out the beginning of the story in chapter 10. Why does Stevenson do that to his readers? Well, it's actually a brilliant technique to force them to read to the end of the novel, isn't it? It's actually really cunning because you're desperate to understand why the events have happened. This is a new form. So normally when you read a novel, you find out why things have happened as you go, and you're constantly trying to reinterpret to see why they happened. But here, you can't work out why they happened. That information is not available until the very end. So it's a very cunning way of writing in a new form, in a way that will be novel to Stevenson's readers and therefore delight them. Why else is he writing the novel? Because he's giving them what they want, which is salaciousness, which is gossip, which is murder, the excitement of the tabloid newspaper. Stevenson himself didn't rate this novel at all. He was very disappointed in it because of the subject content. Now that's important because what we find out is he has to present the novel as a kind of Christian story where evil is punished, where people who behave in non-Christian ways, Hyde and Jekyll, get punished by death. But actually, Stevenson himself was an atheist, didn't believe in God. And within months of it being published, he left Britain forever. He went off travelling and then ended up living his final years in Samoa. So he totally rejects the society that's portrayed in the novel because he doesn't respect it, but he also totally rejects those readers' views. He's writing for readers whom he doesn't respect, who have a Christian perspective on life which he disagrees with. And so when you go back to the novel, you're able to reinterpret certain events where Stevenson celebrates the pagan. Stevenson celebrates many aspects of Hyde which his readers will be disgusted by. And that's why Jekyll at the end talks about his great pity for Hyde and talks about Hyde's great love of life. Jekyll sympathises with Hyde because Stevenson sympathises with Hyde. In fact, when he goes to Samoa, you can see photos of this online, he's living effectively with tribal communities. You know, they wear hardly any clothes. They live in a very simple tribal way. Many of them have converted to Christianity, but their behaviours and their instincts are far more natural. They're not constrained by society. They're not hypocritical. So, what I've done with the mystery and tension there isn't just about the mystery and tension that the reader gets through trying to uncover the plot. I've also introduced a sophisticated idea that it's the mystery and tension of trying to work out why Stevenson has written the book in the first place and how he's suffering from the tension of giving the readers what they want and also giving them what he really believes. So that's such an easy way to get a grade 9. Well, you're probably not going to get the question on mystery and tension. However, you now know enough to be able to apply everything I've told you to that question, whatever the question is. So even if the question is on Utterson, you could start talking about the mystery of why Utterson is portrayed as he is. Does he have a strong attraction to Jekyll that is perhaps sexual, or merely curious, or merely jealous about his friendship with Hyde or Lanyon? You can play with it as much as you want, but you can introduce the idea of the mystery and the tension behind Stevenson's thoughts, Stevenson's disrespect for his audience, Stevenson's disrespect for Utterson, who is, after all, a complete hypocrite. He is a lawyer who's supposed to be on the side of the law, but what does he do when he finds out that it's Jekyll's cane that Hyde has used to kill Sir Danvers Carew? Keeps it secret. What does he do when he finds out that Hyde is potentially blackmailing Dr. Jekyll and therefore deeply involved with the murder of Sir Danvers Carew? Nothing. He keeps it secret from the police. So he is a character who is reprehensible. He's totally immoral, but the reader thinks, well, is he immoral? You know, he's just defending his friend. Yes, his friend is potentially an accomplice to murder, or potentially an actual murderer, because it was his cane that did the deed. Utterson doesn't know that it was actually Hyde who did it and not Dr. Jekyll. He's got no alibi. So that's how you apply this idea about the mystery of Stevenson's purpose to whatever the question is. Now, let's jump to the Inspector Calls paper. So, the Inspector Calls says, how far does Priestley present Eric as a character who changes his attitudes towards himself and others during the play? Now, it'll be a lovely question to get, because Eric is a reprehensible character. He appears to learn the inspector's lesson, but actually, we find out that he doesn't accept responsibility for having stolen money from his father's business. He says, not really, when he's asked if he stole it. He said, I intended to pay it back, even though he has no prospect of paying it back. He talks about what he's done to Eva Smith, but he says, I can't really remember it. I was drunk. And I was in a state where a chap easily turns nasty. I threatened to make a row. These are all ways of not telling his family and not admitting to himself what he's actually done. Now, you probably won't get Eric as your question. How are you going to be conceptualized? In exactly the same way. So in your plan, you're going to sit back and think, right, why is Priestley creating this character in this way? Well, he's only ever creating the characters in order to get forward his point of view. So you've prepared his point of view. You've prepared what his point of view is about socialism, or about Christianity, or about capitalism, or about industrial unrest, or about the working class. You know, you have prepared your interpretations of why Priestley has written this play in terms of how's he trying to persuade his audience. Well, once you've got that list of reasons, you can now look at that character and relate whatever you say about that character to those reasons. That's what will make your answer more conceptualized. So, talk about the character as a construct. That's a word that the examiners love because it proves you know this isn't a real person. This is a person that the playwright has created in order to get a particular effect. Yes, do come in. I'm only live. So anyway, that's an easy way to get a top grade. Now, hopefully I've persuaded you to do the theme question. And in this case, the theme question was, how does Priestley explore the importance of social class? Now, that is a horrible question because you probably thought, oh, I didn't prepare about social class. I prepared about socialism, or I prepared about gender and the patriarchy. Damn, I didn't prepare about social class. What am I going to do? Well, don't worry. It's actually the same question. So you look at social class and you'd say, okay, I've prepared to write about the patriarchy. How do women and men in the play behave differently with social class? Oh, Well, it's Sybil Burling who kind of establishes what the social class is in the play. So I'll write about Sybil Burling and how she responds to patriarchal demands. Brilliant. You might look at Gerald and say, he seems to be the male in the play who has most power in working out what the inspector's up to. The inspector decides that he's the least guilty. I don't believe that, but the inspector seems to say that. So is that because he is superior in social class that actually he seems to get away with more? When we look at Eric, he's had this varsity education, which means he's gone to Oxford or Cambridge. He comes from this superior background, and yet he's actually the criminal in the play who's actually stolen money, and actually committed a crime. So what is Priestley saying about social class? He's arguing that the upper classes are effectively criminals. You might have prepared an answer which says, well, capitalism is like theft. Capitalism, like the Burlings and Crofts, exploit the workers. They earn high profits. The workers aren't able to strike to get high wages because they don't have savings and they get sacked like Eva did. And so social class, therefore, allows the rich to exploit the poor. So your point about capitalism now becomes your point about social class. So dealing with the themes in this way is really easy because whatever the question is, you bring it back to what you already thought the play was about. Okay, let's step back a bit here, so it doesn't matter which text you've written about. Let's ask the question, how much should you write? Students often say to me, how many paragraphs should I write? Well, I hate that question because it doesn't matter. You've got a 50-minute time limit. So the real answer is you write for all of your 50 minutes and no more and no less. So wherever you are in your argument, when you get to 5 minutes to go, you write your conclusion, no matter what. But most students will go, oh, that doesn't help me. I want to know how many paragraphs. So write 8 paragraphs. First paragraph introduces your thesis. Your thesis contains 1, 2, or 3 points about the author's purpose, depending on how much you know. You can get a top answer with 2 purposes in your thesis. I prefer to go for 3. Don't panic if you haven't got 3, you're going to do 2. Don't just do 1 unless you can't think of more, because what will happen is you'll panic. I've only got 1, I can't start. No, put the 1 in, then start your answer. Halfway through your answer, you'll realise, oh, I've got another purpose. Just go back and add it to your thesis statement. Chill out, don't worry. So, thesis statement is number 1. The last paragraph is your conclusion. Everything else in the middle is going to be easy to write because you're going to work through the text chronologically. Don't jump about to different parts because that will confuse you and confuse the reader. But going through chronologically is easy because you get stuck and then you think, oh, what's the next most important thing about this character? What happens next? It's actually quite easy to think your way through the answer. So if you want the answer, how many paragraphs is 8? If you are after a grade 9 or a grade 8, typically those answers are 800 to 1,000 words. That's typical. So that's an easy way to do it. Another great thing about writing quickly and writing loads is the examiners will ignore stuff that you've written that isn't very good. So if you've written 1,000 words and 200 words are, mediocre, you'll still have 800 words of grade 9. The examiners will give it to you. Whereas if you've written 900 words, 200 words are still mediocre, and you've got 700 of grade 9, they'll go, grade 8. Yeah, so write as much as you can. It's definitely much better for you. There are 5 words that you can use all the way through these answers to guarantee you top marks. They're not subject terminology. They are words that make you talk about the writer's perspective. They are because, although, therefore, however, consequently. And if you keep using those 5 words all the way through your essay, it will be impossible for you to get a low mark because all of those 5 words help you write about the author's purpose. So, what else do you need to know? There's one other question that students ask me, and this is a bit of a dodgy one. So some students have said to me, look, Mr. Salles, these texts are now optional. So my school has decided we're going to answer on these two texts, but the other one they've ditched. However, the one they've ditched, I really like. I thought I was much better at that, and I want to answer on that. Can I do it? So the answer is yes. Your teachers aren't in the exam room with you. So there are 3 texts to choose, and you can only write about 2 of them. You can choose the ones that you have prepared for best. Okay? You have to read the questions on all 3 texts if you're doing that. Don't go in there thinking no matter what, I'm going to write on these 2. Read all 3, choose the one that you know best. For most of you, you will have probably looked at what your teachers have said, you're just doing these 2. Most of you are going to go in and say, well, that's the only 2 I'm doing, and that's fine. But for the few people who have asked me, do I have permission? Then the answer is yes. The exam boards don't know which texts your teachers wanted you to answer on. They don't care. So they only want you to answer on 2. Now that is important because there's bound to be at least one person in your class who decides to answer all 3. Like, it's bound to happen. And the examiners will just mark 2 of those, right? They won't mark 3. So make sure you spend 50 minutes on each question and that you only do 2. So this has been a very interesting live stream because it's telling me that nobody's watching and nobody's liked it. So I'm going to upload it now, and it may be that it's not recorded and nobody's seen it. Oh my God. Doesn't matter anyway. Good luck tomorrow. Please let me know in the comments how you did, and I'll see you on the other side. Oh, how do we turn it off? Voila. Orientation is locked.